material for discussion here, and we've got quite some time for discussion, so it's planned until 12:30, general discussion, I guess, on all the things that Laurent pointed out, but also the things that, other things that came up during the workshop. So the floor is open for discussion. Yes,
well, one of the things you mentioned about the organizational theory, this is something I'm kind of wondering is where it goes in the taxonomy of these things, whether it's a hybrid that's kind of halfway between, or whether it's a specification of a kind of systemic account. And so maybe the organizational folks can tell me where to put it.
My doctor was trying to locate my point of view is that this account tries to integrate the two intuition, but not in the the integration is not between the systemic account and the selected effect, but integrates a systemic perspective and an etiological perspective. But the important point is that it provides a different understanding of etiology, not an evolutionary one, but a systemic interpretation of etiology, in the sense that you can answer the question why that trait is there, because it maintains systems, which is a condition for maintenance of the trait. So the integration, in my view, is not, of course, the evolutionary account is not an evolutionary, does not integrate evolutionary as perspective, is not in that sense. So the integration is between etiological and functional biology, in a sense. That would be my which means that it, the organizational account is supposed to ascribe functions to the same cases than the systemic account, but not necessarily to the selected effect theories, because there may be evolutionary functions, there may be some different conclusion on functional ascriptions between organizational and evolutionary functions. So that's my interpretation.
Well, there are several things that I want to say, because not only with respect to that, I should add that even for a system that, imagine, because it's created in a synthetic biology procedure, so without any historical result, the organizational approach could attribute function to such system. On the other hand, Laurent has raised a couple of questions, much more related with my own talk. One thing is the dysfunction, whether the idea of dysfunction requires development. Not necessarily, because a system, imagine a unicellular system that achieves some form of adaptivity through a regulatory mechanism. And there are practically all present day known prokaryotic organisms are able to perform such a form of activity. According to the approach that I have presented, if some structure, for instance, a protein or a cilia or a flagellum or some part has some structure modification that precludes to fulfill the normative, the regulatory norm, then it would be dysfunctional according to my approach. Second point is the question of reproduction. I think that the reproduction could be defined as a specific form of self-production, in which the production of some components implies some growth, and provided that there are forms of fission of the compartment, they produce, and some form of inheritance, they produce cell reproduction. So cell reproduction is a specific case of the class of self-producing entities. And according to that, and it also implies a material continuity. And for doing that in present-day life, we require also self-replication of some structures, for instance, DNA, but this is a part of the process. So in this framework, I think does not produce a difficulty for the organizational account. And well, there are many other questions that have been arised for the case of the oxygen, but I want not to monopolize my intervention.
That's something about the oxygen case, which is a general issue actually, not just for one or the account. I would not, intuitively, I would say that you should not ascribe functions to oxygen. And I was curious about the fact that you say that biology usually do ascribe functions to the oxygen, because it seems to me that there is a distinction between the fact that you have biological structures parts which perform functions, and the things on which function are exerted. And typically, to me, oxygen is as energy, something like that. So we use energy, oxygen, and food, and so on to perform functions. But those entities are not themselves functional, rather than resources or something.
Biologists are using the term in a loose sense, and I'm not saying that they should do that.
Okay, so you think that biologists usually do tend to ascribe functions to oxygen, because in that sense I would be prescriptive. I would say we should not, to make this distinction between the role in the organ between functional items and things like oxygen and so on. So I would say that the organizational account would not ascribe functional, and that's, I tend to think that this is a good thing.
Yes, I agree. I agree, it is a good thing, but in their talks, oxygen is said to have a function in a very loose sense.
Okay.
I understand what you just said, Matteo, actually. Where do you put the barrier between molecules and structure that we should ascribe function to or not? Does an amino acid has a function, or say does an aliphatic molecule in the membrane has a function? And in that case, or ATP has a function in that case when, I mean, as oxygen seems to be playing a sort of structural role in certain components of the cell, and is sometimes generated by biological organisms as well. What makes it different? But it's more of a clarification.
The difference is exactly what Laurent was mentioning, the question of being there, the interpretation of being there from Wright's original schema. So in our account, this means that the organism produces. The existence of that thing depends on the fact that there is an organism, not just the fact it is moved from one point to another. So the oxygen is not produced, or this condition of existence don't depend on the existence of the organism, while many other enzymes are there because they are produced by the organism. But of course, there could be cases in which what does produce mean is maybe ambiguous. In most cases, the difference between structure produced and maintained by the organism and resources which are acquired from the environment whose condition of existence are independent is very, very clear. So, for instance, oxygen is there independently from the organism. We use it while we produce and maintain enzymes, or the art, or membranes, or these kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, I still might not be understanding, but rises or decreases of oxygen level in the environment has been fairly dependent on the action of given organisms, right?
Yeah.
And it's, is the difference the fact that it's kind of, I mean, what do you mean by independent of the presence of the organism there? Because it doesn't seem like oxygen or even ATP or things like that have been, I'm not even sure that ATP is actually produced in nature independently of organisms, but I still don't get that barrier, but that may be only me. We might discuss it later, but...
So I can ask about this.
Just a follow-up.
Yeah.
There's to push in the same direction, because as Thomas said, oxygen can be produced, so to photosynthesis, for example, it can be produced, and other times it's brought from the environment. So would you want then to attribute functions to the oxygen that is produced by the organism versus that
there's also
isn't?
other conditions. It's not constraint. It's something which is absorbed and transformed. Constraints are maintained. You know, one of the question is that functions are entities which are locally stable, that contribute to reactions and processes, and oxygen is something which is involved in those processes, transformed. So for other reasons is also the question that it doesn't fit the definition of a constraint. Oxygen is not a constraint, something which is transformed. But there is also this question of there might be cases which some structure is used by the entity, so it could fit the definition of a constraint, and the question whether it's produced or not by the system could be limiting case. For instance, those animals which use rocks in their those kind of. So there can be some cases in which even though the structure complies with the definition of a constraint, the question whether it's produced or not by the system could be puzzling.
But for you, this is very important to be able to say that, right? The fact, so it is potentially a problem for the account if there is ambiguity.
Yeah.
Then in those cases, it is not clear.
Yeah, but in a sense, I think that there always will be some difficult cases in biology. Don't take this as a problem in itself. I mean, this goes for, but conceptually speaking, something as a function is fit the definition of a constraint, and its condition of existence depend on the fact they are involved in a system. Oxygen doesn't fit most of these conditions, or none of these conditions.
No, I think that part of these difficulties and confusions rise because one thing is that the functional element is the constraint, and the constraint produces on effects, and there is a cascade of physical or chemical effects of the action of the constraint. And for example, the production of many chemical components. But those chemical components, which of course are involved in the global self-production and self-maintenance of the system, that's why in a not very precise way, people say, well, this component plays a role. Okay, but the crucial thing is that the functional element is the constraint that harnesses the chemical process in such a way that produces such amount of oxygen or other chemical components in this moment, etc. Know these processes, and that's why we have made the distinction between processes and constraints, because otherwise these elements could exist outside, etc. And
we still have enormous amounts of time for discussion. Mark?
The same kind of question. I don't know why I'm always thinking about taxonomy. Where does this theory fit in with other theories? I would wonder about Ulrich's theory. Where do I put it on the map? Or is it sort of a meta level theory, since you are amenable to using all three of those large scale accounts?
In a way, it's of course a subset of the systemic account. It can account for the etiological part, but it's not itself an etiological theory, but you can reformulate all the etiological explanations in the framework of my theory. This is only a very small amendment or specification required. Nevertheless, it would not be on the side of the etiological theories, since the etiology is nothing which explains functionality, but I can just reconstruct those explanations. Yeah, but it's also, since it's a subset of the systemic account, the criterion is very important, which discerns between the subset which is explained or which is taken up by my theory, and the subset which remains Kminsian account without referring to type fixation. And so we needed to draw a line and perhaps make a two-dimensional instead of a two-dimensional space where we can place the accounts and have a on the abscissa some I don't know what we could write there that makes clear this here is the type fixed and this is the non-type fixed just physical interaction part. Space of the systemic account and how large the overlaps between our two accounts are. I mean, since Alvaro just pointed out, and you also, Matteo, that only those components which are produced, or those constraints which are produced by the cell, count as functional. I would like to ask you, well, this production in a way is a production according, in my terms, to fixed types or something like that, so that there might be a large overlap. I guess your account is much more restricted since I allow for functions which are going to the outside or even running into nothing or reacting to conditions in a way that are not under all circumstances helpful for the maintenance of the organism. So I don't have this criterion, and yeah.
The question is how exactly works. So it's a question of clarification, the type restriction, type fixation, and why you could not apply that to physical systems. So can you explain a bit more what this, because it's fundamental for your account to understand, and if understood correctly, you want to restrict type fixation to relevant class of system, biological, technological, and sociological. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, first of all, I simply don't see in physical theories that they explain their phenomena in a way which refers to type fixation. So there is no reason why not also a physical system or a component of a physical system could be type fixed. However, physical theories do not conceptualize the entities they're describing in such a way. And as I said after the talk in a discussion, it's mainly a matter of how fine-grained you are describing the entities. And biologists seem to have a perspective where this graininess of types is a bit weaker than in the physical perspective. So physicists would say this entity is of type A or it's not of type A, and then if it's of type A, it has all the properties of an entity of type A. Biologists are more willing to accept entities being token of types which are not true instantiations, and they are referring to the type fixation in order to decide to which type the entity belongs. And in principle, this would be possible in physics, but physics doesn't seem to be to have such needs, and physics doesn't seem to gain very much from functional explanations from this input of normativity. I mean, it was simply abandoned in Renaissance, I would say, without having a proof that there is no normativity in physical nature. It just had no further explanatory value. And so physicists abandoned to explain on this level. And it might be that in physics, what it was already mentioned, physics of dissipative systems, there comes up some need, or at least some advantage of reintroducing this kind of explanation also into physics. And I would dare to predict that then physicists would also describe those systems as type fixed and use this as the norm, decisive norm between function and dysfunction.
Concerning requirement of something that should be produced by the organism as in order to be a functional trait. This is for the grounding of function, but once there are organisms themselves act as such agents, and then also not necessarily by producing within themselves things, but just by constraining the action of, for example, the flows of matter and energy. Or imagine a beaver, how is this animal that put sticks in order to make dams? Yes, by manipulating sticks, they produce also a harnessing flows of the river, and this is a functional action. So it's not necessary to apply that in a strict sense, provide that by the grounding that, of course, we need organisms, and organisms exist because they produce their own constraints. Then there are many other levels in which the concept of functional trait is not necessarily produced within the organism, but the organism as an agent, etc., etc.
So my question actually goes back to Ulrich's comment, because I also wonder about where your account of function fits. And it seems to me that because you are silent on how these types are fixed, and your account is consistent with many different accounts of function, to me it seems like it's not so much an account of function as it is an account of the source of normativity of functions. That's like, however you fix this type, what makes it normative in this minimal sense that we have abstracted and so on, is the type-token relation. And it reminds me of a paper by Peter McLaughlin, who has on the sources of normativity, and there he argues that none of these standard accounts of function actually like have normativity in like their recipe for function. It's just that there is always either the type-token relation, or the means-end relation, or the Partour relation, which gives rise to this normativity. So I was wondering if you have any view about those other two sources that McLaughlin cites in that paper. Like, are you committed to saying that like the means-end relation does not play this kind of role in a theory of function, or the Partour relation cannot, it's just the type-token relation?
Yeah, the means-end relation introduces teleology in the strict sense, I would say. And I don't see that a scientific theory should refer to means-end relations or to teleology if it can do otherwise. And if I'm looking at biological theories, biologists are designing their theories without referring to ends. They are referring to ends when talking colloquially or didactically or something like that. But usually in the research papers, they are very careful in this regard. So means-end relation would certainly be sufficient to introduce norms, but it's too much. And so if you can get the norms cheaper, you should do so. And we, as philosophers, we should also not try reconstructing biological theories more teleologically than they are designed. And part-whole relation, I think this depends on how you define a whole. You can, of course, see the atom as a whole, and part-whole relation between the components of the atom, the protons, neurons, and electrons. And the atom, I don't see that in physics this is conceived as a functional explanation or as a functional relation, and also not as a normative relation. So I would not use the general part-whole relation as a point of reference here. What you can do, of course, is if you have a demanding concept of a whole, for example, a cybernetic concept of a whole, which is also in the background of the organizational theory, then this is sufficient also to introduce normativity, though I see problems in spelling it out in detail with all the functions. But then you introduce the normativity not just by the part-whole relation, but by the definition of what counts as a whole. And so the most general, for me, is the type-token relation, which also in itself is not normative, but which you can take as a norm.
So just a short comment on explanations in physics. Like in mechanics, you could say that every token of the type of the battle with water, if you put it into a freezer, it would. Sorry. So there are some explanations in physics or in mechanistic physics that would actually explain why all the types of these objects would explode if you would put it into a freezer, right? So you could have the same token type relation, and you according to your account, you should derive normativity from that. But that's a short comment, and then it is related to a more substantial comment. Well, if you, according to your account, if the types and tokens, these things are there in the world, then for functional explanations, you don't need the function to be normative, right? There doesn't need to be a norm in the functional account to explain why tokens behave in a certain way. But it would be maybe more interesting to introduce normativity only for this function. Would you agree with that?
I think I'm starting with the second part. I think, of course, we are talking, or biologists are talking normatively only with regard to being able to talk about dysfunctions, but this does not mean that talk about functions is not also normative. So if as soon as you introduce the concept of dysfunctionality, you also have the opposite of dysfunctionality, which is functionality, and then the distinction is a normative distinction. And so the function will be the proper fulfillment of a causal role, but this proper is the normative aspect of being a function. Otherwise, you could also have a purely descriptive account and say each causal role, this is the original Kaminsian account, each causal role is a function, but then you don't have dysfunctions. And as soon as you introduce dysfunctions, you restrict the realm of functions to the non-dysfunctioning functions, and this means that also the positive concept of a function then is normative. The other aspect, if you put the bottle into the freezer, of course, physicists are talking about tokens of types and make general judgments about how types behave, but that is not related to any normative aspect. The normative aspect comes in via the theory, via the biological theory, and not via the physical theory. If you're looking at it from a more pragmatic view, from what you can do with the bottle, then of course normativity comes in because the bottle breaks and it has no longer the function of being a container of water. But this is not the physical description. This is just from what you can do with it.
Distinction of no functions and these functions. So function O function could be purely descriptive, and therefore you could have functional explanations without normativity, and then this function would be more specific concept that would require normativity.
I think we need to discern different pair of contrary concepts. And we have on the one hand the distinction between non-function and dysfunction. A stone, except in an Aristotelian sense, which is just lying on the floor, does not have a function, and a stone which is falling down does not have a function. It does there's just a process going on. A bird which is flying, then there the flying has a function, and also a seed falling down, the falling down has a function, a biological function. So we have this distinction between non-functioning and functioning, and if something is functioning then, or can be functioning, then we have the additional distinction between functioning and dysfunctioning. But a dysfunctioning item is not a non-functional item. It is an item to which the function is still ascribed. You are not ascribing a function to the falling stone, but you are ascribing a function to a seed which is falling not properly, or to the falling of the seed.
Yeah, follow up on that. Yes, but according to your account, the malformed heart is not a token of a type of a heart.
It is. According to my account, it is. Oh. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. Yeah. And you say it's a malformed heart, so it's a heart, but it's malformed.
But I think also that dead people are not people, so that's.
What do you say?
Dead people are not human, you know. It's just when someone dies, he ceases to be a human. We can say it's a dead person, but we don't mean that it is really a person.
Yeah,
I think that's
we can't say that anything is dysfunctional, but if we are regarding the corpse still as a human being, then everything is, or almost everything is dysfunctional in there.
Yes. Yes. But this is where normativity and imported normativity plays a role.
Yes, the normativity is in counting a non-perfect instantiation of a type still as an instantiation of a type, of this type. This is the source of normativity, and this is also why I agree. My theory to the question before. My theory is a theory how normativity comes into the game here.
Anybody has, in a sense, made this mistake, but sometimes I worry when we talk so often about function versus a dysfunctional token that we're not paying as much attention as we might to sort of degrees of function. And I discovered this when a few weeks ago I was in Aspen, Colorado, which is already very high elevation, and then we went higher elevation, and then I went hiking uphill. My system was functioning to metabolize oxygen, but not as efficiently as I would have liked. And so, you know, we need the normativity, but we need to make sure that we don't forget about gradations of, you know, ideal function versus adequate function versus still functioning, but just not as efficiently as it might. And there are, you know, vast numbers of processes where it's the gradation that is really what we're going to be concerned with, and only at the very sort of low end of the gradation would we say it's dysfunctional, but it can be functioning properly and still leave you huffing and puffing as you walk uphill.
I mean, even in that, just along the same lines, you'll also have gradation of dysfunction. Things can be more or less dysfunctional. So your laptop can be dysfunctioning in some sort of way, but you're still able to like write a paper. But then your laptop can be dysfunctioning to the point that it won't turn on and that you can't even do anything at all. So, you know, I may not care if my computer is dysfunctional in a way that doesn't let me play some video games or whatever, but I'll really care if I can't write papers or, you know, do my job. So I don't know exactly how we draw the line between where things, like on the gradation, where things are functioning and not functioning. That's probably a normative thing based on our goals and what we want to do, maybe. But then in the case where you're going uphill, I don't necessarily want to be huffing and puffing, but I'm still not going to say that the system's dysfunctional. I know it's doing what it's supposed to do. So there's got to be some other normative component other than goals that determines function and dysfunction on the gradation.
Well, I think that's right, although I think in the computer case, what we would probably say is certain processes are fully dysfunctional in your system and other processes are functioning normally. So that would mean overall the computer's functioning, you could say it's at a certain, or maybe the processor is crapping out at a certain efficiency, and so that's why certain processes won't work at all. But that's a slightly different case than a process that is working, it's just only at X% of optimality.
I mean, you can make it the same case.
Yeah.
So, like, suppose Microsoft Word is starting to not work, so it's taking me, like, whenever you hit a keystroke, it takes forever for the letter to appear on the screen, and when you hit save, it takes 20 minutes for it to save. So even then, like, you could still write a paper. It would take forever, but you could still do it, and perhaps that's, you know, it's better, that's better than Microsoft Word not working at all.
No.
No?
I think that's the normal functioning level of Microsoft Word.
Oh.
Yeah, I think your idea is very close to what Canguilhem thought about function and else. Because if you stay in low altitude, then you are in good health. But as soon as you are climbing, your system starts to dysfunction. So you cannot experience or overcome major changes in its environment. It means that your health is not so good as it could have been. So I think your idea is maybe quite close to this one. And, well, I don't know what you think, but this was the core idea of the entire research program of Georges Canguilhem about health and malfunction, dysfunction.
Insurance thing wanted me to take this little quiz. They're trying to make you think about your health so you'll behave more healthily. And they ask you these questions like, how healthy are you? And I'm like, better than some, not as good as others. You know, and yeah, I'm sure I'm not ideal. I'm ideal compared to when I was sick with the flu, but not as ideal compared to a long distance runner. And so they're all, you know, I just worry that we focus so much on this sort of on-off functioning or dysfunctioning that I think most of the theories can certainly account for these gradations, but sometimes we end up having sort of tunnel vision about functioning versus not, when many of the cases that biology is interested in are these sort of degree type cases.
It's kind of important to have the idea of on and off, though. If you have like ideal functioning, an account of that, and ideal dysfunctioning, and an account of that, once you kind of have like the two ends of the spectrum, you can kind of use that theory to fill in the gradation. But if you begin by focusing on the gradation, then you've got a lot more moving parts to try and figure out. Whereas if you figure out the ends, then you can kind of work your way inwards. So I don't know if it's necessarily a mistake where people are like tunnel visioning, focusing on just on and off, but I think it's like, well, if I have an account of dysfunction, ideally specified, whatever that means, and if I have an account of ideal function, once we get these right, which we still are debating, then we can talk about the stuff in the middle.
Shane, you?
Yeah, I'd almost convinced myself into reconsidering the point, but part of me wants to stick up for Mark's health here.
Thank you.
Is it dysfunctioning in this case, or is it simply that you know, your lungs are doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing? It's just once you get over 2,000 meters, the air is quite a bit thinner. It doesn't seem to me necessarily that anything's not acting as, in any relevant sense, it should be. Any more than we'd say that you know, if I take a normal road car and I drive it into sort of a very, very muddy path, it's going to slip and not have traction. And I don't know that I want to say that it's malfunctioning or it's dysfunctioning or that its functioning is anything less than optional or optimal. It's just not really suited to these conditions.
Yeah, but you can take that case a step further, and then you end up at system mismatch theory. And then you end up with things that we count as dysfunctions not being dysfunctions. So if you're thinking that you know, your car isn't dysfunctioning when it loses its grip, you're going to say things like, you know, if I have a non-human case, and then I'll get to a human case, if I have a smoke detector that's supposed to go off when there's smoke, and I put it in a smoky room, it's always going to go off. It's not dysfunctioning. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to. It's just not in the best environment for the smoke. Well, for me, because my ears, I don't want to hear that. But there are certain people, there's a lot of research being done on this right now, that maybe certain types of anxiety are not the product of a dysfunction, but are the product of a system functioning perfectly fine. We're just in an environment that's not suited for those systems. The thought is dysthymia as a certain type of depression might work the same way. Most Americans living in the United States do not have dysthymia. However, if they move to certain parts of Africa, it's very common to develop this kind of dysthymia, which makes it seem that there's not necessarily some sort of internal mechanism that's dysfunctioning, but perhaps the mechanism's functioning fine, it's just in the wrong environment. But we want to be able to say, a lot of the time, that anxiety is a dysfunction and dysthymia is a dysfunction. So it ends up being kind of strange if you think that those cases that you were presenting aren't dysfunction, but these cases are. They're still the same kind of scenarios.
So this is why I was this is exactly the kind of reasons why I was talking myself out of making the point and sort of taking my hand back down. I'm not really sure. I think the intuitions pull in both directions on this. I'm not sure personally which direction I want to go in, but there does seem to be something not quite right about saying that. I mean, look. So racing cyclists they'll be put into the high mountains specifically because it's hard, right? And I don't think we want to say that their respiration systems are malfunctioning. They're some of the highest functioning ones. We're deliberately just putting them in an environment for which they're not suited. So in Mark's case, the intuitions pull in one direction. In the cases you discussed, I think they pull in another.
I actually don't think they pull the other way. I write a lot about system mismatch, and at least in my arguments, I don't think system mismatches count as dysfunctions. I think the mechanisms are functioning fine, but I do think we want to count them as mental disorders, so then I think there's a bit of a disparity between dysfunction and mental disorder. So some sort of account of mental disorder that relies solely on dysfunction probably won't work because it won't account for these system mismatches.
Follow-ups to this discussion?
Yeah, that maybe there's, it can be even more dangerous to have too much relativity in terms of the notion of dysfunction would be less helpful, because anyway, even if you have those strange cases when you don't know very well if it is a dysfunction or not intuitively, anyhow, the patients or the interesting cases are those in which they have their abilities are really compromising. So I think it doesn't help to say that we cannot put it in that dichotomy, but really providing an explanation for both when it is functioning and when it is not functioning. We cannot get rid of that in practice.
I think one solution for this problem of graduality would be to specify the function. So it is one thing to be able to walk. It's another thing to be able to walk in cities, and a completely different thing to be able to walk in high altitudes. And then we can answer if a system is dysfunctional.
Okay, perhaps this is a good time to shift to the points that Tamar wanted to make.
Right, because I wanted to come back to something that actually, Laurent, you raised in your presentation, and I don't think we have discussed it
yet, at least in this general discussion. It's also the emphasis on processes, because there was something very interesting in the sort of historical reconstruction that you've made with the various people of this 18th and 19th century that tried to sort of be processual and that have been either having good results in their scientific commitments or not good results in their scientific commitment, depending on the discrepancy between, say, their ontology and their science. But can you expand a little more on what do you think the reasons were why, say, Le Dantec failed, basically? Is it because he stuck too much to a processual account in his scientific practice, then it kind of prevented him to make any sorts of heuristic distinctions to it? Or what makes it, for example, or for Lamarck, or what makes it that Cuvier got rather successful instead? And what is then the relation between his sort of processual ontology and his science? Is there a disconnection? Did he completely forget about his ontology when he was doing science? It got me very curious, and I wonder if you can expand on this.
Well, for Le Dantec, there are many reasons why it failed. Maybe the first was because he decided not to perform any lab experiment anymore. And during his life, which was quite short, he wrote 44 books. So about twice a year. And then he became disconnected for real science and empirical data. And this is the main reason why he wasn't able to succeed. He became a kind of crazy people out of the classical scientific world. For Cuvier, I don't know, because I'm not a specialist of Cuvier at all, but I think it's interesting to see how to be efficient. He had to put aside his basic ideas about what an organism is actually. So, and in the whole history of biology, this tension remained between, okay, we know an organism is not an entity, but let's pretend and it works. And this is exactly the case, of course, for molecular biology. Even if most molecular biologists are just there and they do not have an ontological idea of what is an organism. But this tension is part, and a big part, of the history of biology. For instance, Claude Bernard also thought of an organism ontologically as something like a process. But in order to develop experimental physiology, he decided to work on specific function. And
this is quite interesting, I find, because so, for example, there's this project in Exeter called Process Ontology for Contemporary Biology. So then maybe helping like the science being informed by a processual perspective. So then, I mean, according to this short historical summary, this kind of project, I mean, the scientific consequences of the project would be sort of misguided, or sort of hopeless, or I mean, I don't know. No, I mean, this is more or less what it shows.
I'm not saying that.
I have a comment and an answer to your question. The comment is that your choice of examples is astonishingly biased in all kinds of ways. First, it's all French people. Then, to use Bergson as an example of a biologist is odd. To present Cuvier as a success in biology, an anti-evolutionist, is odder. And then there's a whole series of a tradition of process biology from Waddington to Thome, a whole research program of process structuralism in the 70s and 80s that were not mainstream but very fruitful. And the reason we need a process ontology right now is twofold. First of all, it is the adequate ontology for biology. There is nothing but processes in biology. That's very simple. The other reason is that we now have the technological abilities, the experimental abilities to create time series of data. We have the computational abilities for the first time in history to model and simulate these processes. So adopting a process ontology, this is the time where we have to do it, and it will be very fruitful, and it's very necessary to do it Molecular biology hasn't been successful because it is conceptually inconsistent. It has been successful despite the fact that it is conceptually inconsistent. And so, yes, that's about all I have to say about this.
Yes, I think the technology argument is a very good one. Now technology could take into account a process center view. Well, my only disagreement is about Cuvier, but this is a...
But I also does not fall into false debates. It's not because we are adopting a process ontology then we can avoid talking about things. It's just a matter of theory. If you adopt a process ontology, then it can modify the way you ask questions. You say, behavior is changing all the time. How do we account for stabilities? But we have to, of course. And things is just a term to talk about stabilities or the ability of tracking properties to time. So, in a sense, is very fruitful to talk about, but I don't see any contradiction in saying that I am adopting a process ontology and then I try to understand how biological things work, because it's just a matter of clarifying the theoretical use of things, stability, and so on. Otherwise, I don't even understand how we can make biology about change. No, we have to look for something that lasts enough so that we can talk about it. So, I mean, I'm not sure that we should avoid, for instance, I'm talking about things. It's just according on what we mean by things, in a way which be consistent with a fundamental process view.
Dan first, then Stefan.
I want to thank Laurent for actually bringing this to the conversation. I mean, questions of ontology. You know, I actually don't see any problem, any conflict really in what you're presenting here. You know, so no, but I agree with with your reconstruction. I actually also agree with Laurent that Cuvier was a huge success in his time, even if he wasn't an evolutionist, because evolution isn't the only standard upon which we measure success of biological theories, at least not the way we used to. And so what you seem to be showing here basically is that for Cuvier, I have a historical question, which is, the definition of the vital vortex comes in his Animal Kingdom, which I think was first published in 1817. So I'm just wondering whether his research program that you have at the scientific level was developed at the same time or after. So maybe, it would be, maybe he changed his mind, maybe not. If he proposed this kind of vortex notion, this very processual notion of the organism, and simultaneously argued that we should study organisms as things that show parts. Even if that's the case, there is no conflict, because what he's basically saying is that at an ontological level we have a particular view of the things that we're interested in, but we realize that those very ideas that inform our ontology are not necessarily the best ones to the most amenable to be translated into an experimental research program. So, there's no problem at all. Can you go to the next slide? So, there are a lot of people in the early 20th century who had a very similar view. People, basically biochemists, who were interested in metabolism and energetics. Most of them, if you read them, they actually are defining organisms and cells in this way. And I wouldn't say, Laurent, that necessarily that it wasn't a fruitful thing. I mean, if you just take to understand what's going on at an energetic level in a cell, it was not only useful, it was necessary to kind of have that ontological framework guiding the experimental work. So if you take someone like Bertalan Lamphey, for example, who had a very processual view, he explicitly referred back to Heraclitus, and he's saying this is what this stream of life notion is what I'm taking to be a fundamental theoretical principle in biology. He used that to develop all kinds of research programs to understand growth, using mathematics, understanding development through a notion of steady states. And so it doesn't seem obvious to me that a processual ontology is necessarily, not valuable from an experimental point of view. Now, Yogi gave some examples of that in the last 30, 40 years from Waddington onwards, but I could give you examples from before that as well. It's just that an important point, I think, is that we need to remember that we have two levels of description. Okay, so the constant, pervasive, seductive appeal to machines since Descartes until the 21st century in biology can have only an ontological component, but it can, also a heuristic one, or only a heuristic one, right? An idealization, a convenient idealization, because this ontology, even though even this view, even though it doesn't reflect the ontology of life, gives us a way of investigating it. Now, the problem has been when these epistemic, heuristically useful notions have been so successful that we've forgotten that there were idealizations. We have basically derived our ontology on the basis of ideas that were useful experimentally. And so when that's happened, and it's happened frequently, then that's when you've had this kind of consolidation of ontological, an ontological picture that in other ways we know it to be wrong. We know it to be problematic. We know that an organism is a process that is exchanging matter and energy, and that's already, we are told that by what thermodynamics has to say about organisms. So in a way, the problem is, as I say, to just distinguish between the ideas that we should use to inform our ontology from those that actually allow us to develop experimental research programs and just to remember that these do not necessarily have to coincide, but sometimes they can. As methods become more sophisticated, we have ways. For example, the problem with developing a processual methodology is time, right? So a lot of traditional methods in biology have been ones that abstract time. Think about anatomy. You desiccate, you fix, you stain. And what are you left up with? You're left up with structures, and you can study structures atemporally. If you study structures, you may just forget that you're dealing with something that is an artifact, and you just may assume that that's what there is in the first place, a structure on the basis of which we can confer functions. And you forget that what you've actually done is removed something that exists in a steady state, energetically maintained, metastable system, and you're just dealing with an artifact. Because it's successful and it gives you, you can generate lots of data about that particular structure, you forget that structure actually in life exists as a steady state most of the time, right? So I think it's important to distinguish this thing. I did a final point about function, right? So, we need, when we think about functional descriptions, I mean, this is something that I've been grappling and trying to understand, to what extent these descriptions are ontological or they're epistemic, yeah, I think it's a worthwhile thing to ask ourselves in debates about function, the extent to which we assume these functions to be, ontological or not, and the reasons why we may, the reasons and the assumptions that we make when we decide our stance on that.
So I found the point, Yogi's point, sorry, on like process ontology and the kind of technology we have now quite interesting. So if I got that right, the idea might be that process ontology is something we kind of afford now because we have the technology which can kind of trace the processes, while before we didn't this constant reference to mechanisms and artifacts and fixed structures because we didn't have really the technology to trace the process. So one could say that the project on process ontology as the ontology for contemporary biology. So we need process ontology now for contemporary biology, also because we now have the technology and to trace the process. So I was wondering you kind of replied to my point here, replying to the point before, but I was wondering what you thought about this connection between process ontology and kind of technology which allows us to trace the thing.
You also mentioned, so essentially, before we we were more likely to forget that given that we were dealing with artifacts, biological samples essentially, we were likely to forget that because we were just dealing with them, that those samples are artificial. But we needed to do that because of our methodological restrictions. As we have means now of studying organisms temporally, then it is much easier for one to feel that one is dealing with a stabilized process. It doesn't. But the point is that it was never wrong. Okay, so the process ontology was never wrong. I mean, even in the 19th century, the reasons why people appealed to process ontology were legitimate, and it's just that some understood that if they wanted to, generate a productive research program, that they would need to have a kind of a scientific, a kind of an epistemic kind of description of these systems that perhaps was in conflict with what they knew to be the nature of the thing that they were looking at.
I still have problems to see why we need a process ontology, because as Matteo said, it's just a different perspective. We need both. We need the processes and we need the entities which are moving through time, sometimes changing, sometimes remaining. And if you say we now have the technology to trace processes, this is semantically very strange for me. You cannot trace a process, you can trace an entity through time, and this gives you the process. Or you can perhaps investigate or look at a process as an entity, but as soon as you say you are tracing it through time, you don't have a process ontology. Also, if you're studying organisms in time, you're studying organisms as entities in time and not organisms as processes. Nevertheless, it might be helpful to have this process ontology in the background, but then we needed to learn completely, to speak completely different about these things. So what I'm just pointing at that all you said is still in the terminology of a classical entity ontology and not of a process ontology, and that we probably do not really have an idea how we could do biology in a process view. Even if I read John Dupré, I still don't understand how that should work.
I see two hands. We have three actually. We've run out of time, I'm afraid. Good. I hear someone say good. There's still one bit to talk about, namely publication plans. I have no clue who's going to do that and how long that's going to take. So do we still have time for a couple of more? Yes? Okay. So Yogi, Dan, and I think you will have the final.
So practically, I mean, we're using dynamical systems models to study developmental processes, and the explanations are all in terms of attracting states and all that. And that is a process view, in my view. I strongly disagree, but I'm not philosophically informed about that, of course, that you cannot, that saying tracing a process is inconsistent with a process ontology, because what you're really interested is are the causes of the transformations that you see, and we had some discussions here also about the neo-mechanistic view, which is, in my view, a sort of a process view in the end, because you can abstract the entities away and interpret them, as Matteo said, as slow processes, basically, depending on the time scale you're looking at. Having said that, I would be interested in how it actually, we brought this up early in the week with Dan's talk, how does this relate to the debate about function? I still have a hard time seeing that. I mean, I think a process ontology is kind of consistent with pretty much all the accounts that we discussed this week, but maybe people have different opinions. I would still be curious to hear if this is actually, this sort of question is actually relevant to the function, the debates about function.
Quick answer. I would say that you need to track things which are stable enough to be the object of functional descriptions. So you have things that change all the time, and then if you want to ascribe a function, then it means that you are able to locate some entities which are stable, that you can treat as if they were not changing at a relevant time scale, and then you can try to ascribe functions. But actually, I don't think you can really disagree with Ulrich when he says what you are tracking in a process. You need to track something. So you need some conserved properties at some time scale. is a sort of very, very fundamental, but I don't even think that we really disagree on that. I think this is a matter of even terms, in a sense, because I would prefer to clarify that sometimes, because I think that there's no real issue there. I think. So.
Yeah, I mean, Ulrich, to say that it's not really a perspective because you're tracking entities is to make the question, because you are using the language of the account that I'm saying is problematic in understanding the process, right? So what I would say.
I repeat, how are you talking about?
Well, as Yogi mentioned, you talk about you talk about states, you talk about transformations, you talk about equilibria, and you talk about, there are many ways in which you can track something, and I don't mean as a thing, but an entity or whatever, a phenomenon, that doesn't necessarily have to have as a unit of analysis a stable material unit. There are many other ways. Right, but if that's the case, then there are other ways in which you can track processes. And then an answer to Yogi about how all of this relates to function. I guess, so the idea is that when you attribute functions, you have something that is the bearer of the function. And so the question that I try to address in my talk is, if that thing that is the bearer of function is just a stabilized process, then the very distinction between structure and function, trait and function collapses, and so they're basically one and the same in a way. You can't have one without the other. So that was the attempt to kind of bring it into conversation. And with the question about the background ontology is one that I'm still. So Matteo mentioned the organizational account seems to be compatible with an ontology that doesn't necessarily have to assume material entities, and I have to think about that a bit more.
Final comment?
No, but it's just a quick comment. Abstracting time doesn't mean fixing things in time. That would be non-abstracting time. Abstracting time is just not talking about time. And it seems that you think that when we do the abstraction, the entities have to be somehow fixed in a specific point of time.
Okay, with that, we've reached the end of the general discussion. Let's thank Laurent for his comments.